The first night at the shelter, my daughter asked me if we were going to be okay. She was 7. She had her chapter book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was watching me fill out the intake form. I said yes. I said it the way I say everything, without trembling, without any particular performance. I did not know yet how exactly true that answer was going to be. 6 weeks later, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot on a gray December morning, and a man in a gray coat walked toward me holding a blue envelope. What was inside it was worth more than every comfortable room the Haynes family had ever tried to close to us. $920,000 that none of them knew existed, not one. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that the worst moments reveal who really loves you. I think they're only half right. The worst moments also reveal who you already were, what you had already built, what you had already survived, before anyone was watching. There is a kind of preparation that has nothing to do with anticipating the fall. You do not pack the accordion folder because you expect disaster. You pack it because you are the kind of person who understands that life is, at its core, a series of documents. And the ones who don't keep the documents are always surprised when the documents matter. I had worked the front desk of a dental clinic in South Philadelphia for 6 years. I knew every patient file, every insurance code, every copay dispute. It was not glamorous work. I wore scrubs and comfortable shoes, and I kept a labeled accordion folder in my locker for everything that mattered. Pay stubs, lease agreements, Rosie's school records, immunization history, 2 forms of photo identification for each of us. I kept my aunt's last Christmas card in there too, the one from the December before last. It had come after 9 years of silence. I had not thrown it away. I am not entirely sure why. At the time, I told myself it was habit. Later, I understood it differently. When the clinic was absorbed by a larger group in October and my position was eliminated, I had 3 weeks of notice, a letter of recommendation, and $847 in checking. That was the whole inventory. Gerald, my ex-husband, had not worked in 2 years, and his family, the Hayneses, had been providing temporary housing through one of their rental units. I had been grateful for it, the way you are grateful for things that feel provisional from the first moment. Rosie was in 2nd grade. She needed stability. She needed lunch money and immunization records, and a mother who kept the accordion folder. I kept the accordion folder. Roberta Haynes was Gerald's mother. Mid-60s, well-maintained, the kind of woman who arrives at school events in a pressed blouse and leaves with everyone's phone number. She had coordinated the withdrawal of family support over 3 lunch meetings I was not invited to. I know this because Gerald told me afterward, in a tone that suggested he was delivering someone else's message, which, of course, he was. She was the kind of woman who believed that organizing people was the same as caring for them. I had understood this about her for years. I had accepted it, for Rosie's sake, the way you accept a window that doesn't quite seal. Not comfortable, but manageable, until the winter comes. The first sign was Thanksgiving. Roberta mentioned, in a voice just loud enough to carry across the table, that Rosie needed stability. She was looking at her son when she said it, but she was not speaking to him. She was speaking to everyone, and she was speaking about me. I set down my fork and picked it up again without comment. 3 weeks later, I noticed that Gerald had removed my address from the school calendar email thread. Rosie mentioned a school concert, the winter assembly, that I had not known about. I found out when she said, in the car on the way home from her father's, "Did you know about my concert, Mama?" I said I hadn't, and I smiled, and I asked her how it went. She said it went fine. She said she'd played the triangle part correctly. I filed what I was feeling in the same place I file everything, out of sight, but not out of reach. The call came on a Tuesday. Roberta herself, which was unusual, she typically communicated through Gerald, through logistics, through the grammar of minor inconveniences. Her calling directly meant something had been decided. She said the family had spoken and that they would not be able to continue the temporary housing arrangement. I asked if I could speak to Gerald. She said he agreed with the decision. Then she said something I wrote down because I write things down. She said, "You need to find your own situation, Delia. We are not your family." I thanked her. I set the phone face down on the counter. I stood in the kitchen of the Haynes rental for a few minutes, looking at the window above the sink, which had a crack in the caulking that I had reported twice and that had never been repaired. Then I opened the accordion folder and looked at my aunt's Christmas card, Carol Sutton, with a return address in Chester County. She and I had not spoken in 11 years. The family estrangement was old and complicated, and I had long ago stopped being the one who was going to repair it. The card had arrived without explanation, the way some gestures arrive. I had kept it because I am the kind of person who keeps things. The shelter intake form had 43 questions. I answered all of them. Rosie sat beside me in the common room with her chapter book open on her lap, not quite reading, in the way children monitor situations they don't entirely understand by keeping themselves very still. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and donated holiday decorations, tinsel garland pinned along the bulletin board, a small artificial tree on a folding table by the window. I answered every question in the same even hand I use on everything. The concrete inventory of what I had, one rolling carry-on, the accordion folder, the good wool coat that had survived everything, $847 in checking, and one 7-year-old who trusted me so completely that she believed my saying yes meant I actually knew. What I knew, quietly, without yet having any explanation for it, was something about the card. My aunt had not sent me anything in 9 years. People do not send cards to people they have removed from their thoughts. The card had a return address. I had looked at it when it arrived and not done anything with the information. But I had kept the card. I had kept it in the accordion folder, behind Rosie's school records, in the same plastic sleeve as her most recent immunization record. I had kept it because I am the kind of person who keeps things, and sometimes, years later, you understand why. The blue envelope arrived 6 days after intake. Martin Feld found me through the shelter's registered mail system. My Aunt Carol had put the shelter's address in her trust amendment, updated after I gave it to her in a brief phone call the previous March. I had almost not made that call. I had sat with the card for 2 months, and then one evening, when Rosie was at her father's and I was alone in the rental kitchen, I had dialed the number. Carol had answered on the 3rd ring. We had talked for 40 minutes. She was 71. She asked about Rosie. She asked about my work. She did not mention the estrangement, and neither did I. When I gave her the shelter's address at the end of the call, I had already known by then that the housing situation was precarious. She wrote it down. I heard the pen scratch. I learned all of this after. At the time, Martin Feld walked across the gray parking lot in his gray coat and asked if I was Delia Ashford, born Sutton. I said yes. He handed me the certification letter in its blue envelope and waited while I read it. It took about 9 minutes. Rosie watched through the window of the common room the whole time. The trust had been funded 18 months before Carol's death. The amendment naming me sole primary beneficiary had been executed and notarized 14 months before she died. Under Pennsylvania's trust code, no probate was required. The assets passed entirely outside the estate, the 4-bedroom house in Chestnut Hill, appraised at $612,000, no mortgage, and $308,000 in liquid brokerage and savings accounts. Total, $920,000. Carol's adult stepchildren had no standing. They were not beneficiaries. They had no claim. Martin stood at a respectful distance while I read the letter a second time from the beginning, and then I folded it back into the envelope. I went inside to get Rosie. I told her we were going to take a drive. She put her book in her bag. The first call was to Rosie's school, to confirm that the enrollment address would be changing. The woman who answered was the same woman who had processed Rosie's original enrollment. She said, "Changing to where?" I told her Chestnut Hill. There was a brief pause. She said, "That's a nice neighborhood." The second call was to the title company Martin recommended. Their office was on Germantown Avenue. I scheduled the closing appointment for a Thursday, which was 11 days away. Martin's office had also been in contact with Carol's stepchildren, or rather, the stepchildren had contacted Martin's firm within the first week of Carol's death, asserting an interest. Martin's response had apparently been brief and conclusive. They were not beneficiaries of a funded revocable trust. They had no standing. The law on this point was clear. Pennsylvania 20, Pennsylvania CS, Section 7731 et sec, was not ambiguous, and their not being named in the amendment meant they had no avenue of challenge. Martin mentioned this to me almost as a footnote, in the same professional tone he used for everything. I appreciated his manner. He was the kind of attorney who treated every fact as equally factual. Gerald called on a Wednesday. He had heard from someone, I don't know who. The Haynes family had a particular talent for acquiring information from adjacent sources, and he asked if it was really true. I said it was. He was quiet for a long time. I waited. He said, "The house is in Chestnut Hill?" I said yes. He said, "How many bedrooms?" I said 4. Another pause. I told him Rosie's new address and said I would email the updated school schedule. He said okay. I said goodbye. I did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying. On Wednesday evening, I ironed Rosie's school uniform for the following week, already knowing we would not need the shelter cot for another night after Thursday. The iron was one of the things in the rolling carry-on. Of course it was. The closing table was a long oval in a warm office on the second floor of a row house on Germantown Avenue. It was the kind of office that smelled like old paper and carpet, where the wood paneling had been there since before anyone working there was born. Martin sat to my left. The title officer placed the deed in front of me, my name, Carol's name, the trust, and I signed every page in the same even hand I use on intake forms. The title officer said, "Congratulations, Ms. Ashford." No one from the Haynes family was in the room. No one from the Haynes family would ever be in any room of that house. I drove Rosie to see it that afternoon. She walked through the empty rooms in her school coat, her footsteps loud on the bare hardwood floors. She tried each doorknob. She looked at the windows. She said, "The floors are loud." I said yes. She said, "We can put rugs." I said yes. She nodded as if this settled something and went back to her book, sitting cross-legged in the middle of what would be the living room. I sat on the floor of the empty kitchen and cried once, quietly, for my Aunt Carol, who had quietly loved me from 11 years and 1 step away, and had arranged, in legal language, for me to be standing on solid ground at the moment I least expected to be. We moved in 10 days after closing. Rosie chose the room with the bay window for her books. She arranged them by color on the first night, which is not a system that will hold, but it is the system of someone who is pleased to have enough space to have a system. I have kept the blue envelope in the accordion folder. It lives behind the deed, behind the homeowner's insurance documents, behind Rosie's current school records. The folder has a new label, the address, in my handwriting, on a strip of masking tape. It is the most satisfying label I have ever written. At a January birthday gathering for one of the Haynes grandchildren, which I learned about third hand from a school parent who knows Gerald's cousin, a cousin mentioned the house to Roberta. I was not there. I will likely never be at a Haynes family gathering again, which suits me. But I heard that Roberta had set down her fork and not picked it up again for the rest of the meal. I think about that sometimes. Not with satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter than that. She had decided what I was. She had been very sure. The accordion folder was in my carry-on the whole time, and in it was a Christmas card from a woman who had never stopped thinking about me, and I had almost not called the number on the back. Almost. I did not tell anyone at the shelter what was happening. This was a deliberate choice. The women in the common room had their own inventories of trouble, and I did not want my good fortune to cast any shadow on theirs. I smiled at dinner. I helped Rosie with her reading. I answered the intake coordinator's check-in questions with the same measured calm I brought to everything. Martin called me on the second day after delivering the letter. He wanted to walk me through the timeline in more detail, the steps between the certification letter and the title transfer, the sequence of what needed to happen and in what order. I sat in the narrow hallway outside the common room with the accordion folder open on my knees and took notes on the back of a grocery receipt because I had not yet bought a proper notepad. Martin explained that the trust's liquid assets, the $308,000 in brokerage and savings accounts, could be released to me once I presented the certification letter and identification at the relevant financial institutions. The title transfer, similarly, required only the certification and my identification at the county recorder's office. No court filing, no probate proceeding, no waiting on anyone else's schedule. The law was designed to be efficient, he said, and in this case it was. I asked him how long Carol had had the shelter's address. He said since March. I had given it to her in our phone call. I asked how she had come to have the trust in place for so long. He was quiet for a moment. He said Carol had been a careful woman and that she had amended the trust after a conversation with her own physician in which the outlook had been discussed with some specificity. She had wanted to know that certain things were arranged. Martin said this without editorializing, in his professional manner. I thanked him and sat in the hallway for a few minutes after the call, listening to the sounds of the shelter, a television from the common room, someone's child laughing, the radiator clicking. Carol had been careful. She had arranged things. And she had, in the last year of her life, taken a phone call from a niece she had not spoken to in a decade and written down an address in a shelter city and updated a legal document accordingly. I thought about how small that act was in the moment she was making it, and how large it became. The second procedural call was to Rosie's school to arrange a meeting with her teacher. I wanted to handle the transition carefully. Rosie had been enrolled in South Philadelphia. The new district was different. The school was different. And I wanted someone at her current school to understand what was happening so that nothing fell through the cracks, no records delayed, no mid-year enrollment gap. The teacher, a woman named Mrs. Rao, was practical and kind. She said she would have the records packaged within 2 days. She asked if Rosie was adjusting well. I said she was. What I did not say was that Rosie had, the evening before, asked me what the blue envelope was. I had told her it was a letter from a woman named Carol who had been my aunt, my mother's sister. Rosie said she didn't know I had an aunt. I said that was right, and that we had not been in touch for a long time, and that Carol had died. Rosie thought about this for a while. Then she said, "Was she nice?" I said yes. She said, "Is that why we're getting a house?" I said yes. She went back to her book. She is a child who accepts facts as facts, which is a quality I have always admired in her and tried to cultivate deliberately. The stepchildren, Carol's husband's adult children from his first marriage, had retained an attorney within the first 3 days of her death. Martin told me later that their attorney had made an inquiry about the trust's fundedness, specifically about whether the trust had been properly funded and whether the amendment had been executed with the required formalities. Martin's responses had apparently been very brief and very thorough. The trust had been funded for 18 months. The amendment had been executed before a notary. The witnesses were identified and their affidavits on file. Under Pennsylvania's trust code, the requirements had been met in every particular. The stepchildren's attorney sent 2 letters and then went quiet. There was nothing to argue about. The law did not provide them a foothold. I learned about all of this in stages over the course of that 10-day period between the certification letter and the closing. Martin briefed me at each step, what had been filed, what had been responded to, what was no longer in question. He was methodical and calm. He reminded me, in his manner, of the best administrators I had worked with at the clinic, people who understood that a well-organized file is a form of protection, and that the most important thing you can do in advance of any dispute is to have done your paperwork correctly. On the day before the closing, I went to the financial institution that held the largest of Carol's accounts and presented the certification letter. The representative was a young man who called his supervisor when he saw the total. The supervisor came out and handled the paperwork herself. She was professional and efficient, and she congratulated me in a tone that was genuinely warm. I thanked her. I carried the updated balance statement back to the shelter in my coat pocket. I checked it once in the elevator and once again when I was back in the common room. The number did not change between the first look and the second. Rosie was at her table with her book. She looked up when I sat down. She said, "Did you do your errand?" I said yes. She said, "Good." She went back to reading. The people who withdraw the floor from beneath you are rarely paying attention to what you are standing on. My Aunt Carol was paying attention. She arranged it in silence and in legal language, and it arrived exactly when it was needed, in a blue envelope, in a gray parking lot, while Rosie watched through a window with her chapter book in her hands. If someone has ever counted you out, I want to hear about it. Leave your story in the comments. Share this with someone who needs it today. Thank you for listening.